The phone felt heavy in my hand. It had been months since I'd touched it last, apart from charging it now and then to keep it from dying completely. It wasn't even my phone, it was his. The lock screen still displayed the same picture, a goofy selfie he'd taken, his smile as bright as the Arizona sun behind him. He always said I was too serious, that I should learn to laugh at myself. Now the only thing I could laugh at was the cruel absurdity of fate. I sat in the dim light of my one-bedroom apartment, surrounded by the remnants of a life half-lived. Piles of unopened mail cluttered the coffee table, a mix of past due notices and coupon booklets I never bothered to throw away. The dishes in the sink had begun to sprout fuzzy green growths, and the air smelled faintly of spoiled milk. Depression is funny that way. It makes even the simplest tasks feel like Herculean feats. But the phone I couldn't let go of. The accident replayed in my mind every night, even though I tried not to think about it. We'd been driving back from a weekend at Lake Havasu. The drive was long but peaceful, the kind of road trip we used to love. Then, everything changed. The radio crackled with static, loud and jarring. The headlights flickered like a dying flashlight, and then the brakes failed. I remembered his voice, frantic, trying to calm me as the car veered off the road. The crunch of metal and the shattering of glass were the last sounds he ever heard. I survived. He didn't. Now, I was stuck in this purgatory of grief. I'd lost my job 2 weeks after the accident because I couldn't bring myself to show up. The bills piled up faster than I could comprehend, and every day felt like an uphill battle against a mountain of despair. The only thing I had left was his phone, a tether to a life that felt like it belonged to someone else. My apartment was in the kind of neighborhood people move to when they can no longer afford to dream. The buildings were drab and utilitarian, their beige stucco exteriors stained with years of neglect. A cracked sidewalk led to a dingy convenience store where I bought the cheapest food I could find. It was a far cry from the life we'd planned together. We had dreamed of buying a house in Sedona, of starting a family, of growing old together. Now those dreams felt like ghosts, haunting the periphery of my existence. I tried to keep the loneliness at bay by scrolling through social media, but every smiling face I saw only deepened the ache inside me. They didn't know what it was like to have everything ripped away in an instant. They didn't know what it was like to stare into the abyss of loss and feel it staring back. There were moments when I thought I heard his voice. It was never clear, never more than a whisper that could have been the wind or the creak of an old pipe. At first I thought I was losing my mind, but as the days turned into weeks, the whispers became harder to ignore. One night I swore I felt the bed shift, as if someone had sat down beside me. I turned on the light, heart pounding, but there was nothing there. Just an empty space where he should have been. I dismissed it as a trick of the mind, the kind of thing that happens when grief takes root and grows like a weed. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that the universe was trying to tell me something. It happened late one night, long after I'd given up on sleep. I was curled up on the couch scrolling aimlessly through old photos on my laptop. Most of them were of us, laughing, hiking, sharing quiet moments. Each image was like a stab to the heart, but I couldn't stop looking. It was the closest I could get to him now. Suddenly his phone began to ring. I stared at it, the sound slicing through the stillness like a knife. The screen lit up, casting an eerie glow in the dim room. An unknown number flashed across the display, the digits unfamiliar yet strangely ominous. My heart raced as I picked it up. My fingers trembled, hesitating over the answer button. Finally, I slid my thumb across the screen. "Hello?" I answered. For a moment, there was nothing but static, a crackling sound that sent a chill down my spine. Then, I heard it, a voice I would have recognized anywhere. "Babe, it's me," the voice said, distorted but unmistakably his. I froze. The words caught in my throat. It wasn't possible. "Is this some kind of sick joke?" I whispered, tears pricking my eyes. "Who is this?" "It's me," he repeated, softer this time. "I don't have much time. You need to listen." I shook my head, clutching the phone tighter. My chest heaved. My pulse thundered in my ears. This isn't real. You're dead. The static surged before subsiding. I know you're scared, but you have to trust me. Go to the old gas station on Harbor Road, the last one we used before the accident. You'll find answers there, and you'll get the help you need. What help? I cried. What's happening? The call ended abruptly, the screen going dark. I stared at the phone, my mind racing. I wanted to believe it was a cruel prank, but deep down, I knew better. It was him. Somehow, it was him. The gas station on Harbor Road wasn't far, maybe a 20-minute drive. It was one of those old places that had been around forever, its faded sign a relic of a bygone era. I told myself I was crazy for even considering it. This was probably just my grief playing tricks on me, a desperate attempt to hold on to the one thing I couldn't let go of. But the sound of his voice lingered in my mind, pulling me like a siren's call. Before I knew it, I was in my car, the engine humming beneath me as I navigated the empty streets. The city lights faded as I left the suburbs behind, replaced by the vast, empty darkness of the desert. The only sounds were the hum of my tires on the asphalt and the occasional rustle of wind against the windows. The gas station looked even more desolate than I remembered. Its sign flickered weakly, casting erratic shadows across the cracked pavement. A single pump stood sentinel in the middle of the lot, its paint peeling and rusted. As I approached the entrance, the door creaked open, and a man stepped out. He was middle-aged, with thinning hair and a kindly face that seemed out of place in such a setting. His name tag read Jack. "You're here for the job, right?" he asked, his voice tinged with both surprise and relief. "The job?" I repeated, confused. "Yeah, I've been short-staffed for months. I didn't think anyone would actually answer the ad. Come on, I'll show you around." I didn't correct him. Part of me wanted to tell him I wasn't here for a job, but something held me back. Maybe it was his earnestness, or maybe it was the feeling that leaving now would be a mistake. He showed me the security cameras, the cash register, the stockroom. It all seemed mundane, but a knot of unease coiled in my stomach. Jack gave me a quick tour, explaining the basics of the job. It was simple enough: stock the shelves, man the register, and keep an eye on things during the night shift. He was friendly and warm, his gratitude for my presence almost overwhelming. As I nodded along to his instructions, I noticed a small radio on the counter. Jack noticed my stare and chuckled. "Don't worry about that old thing," he said. "Barely works half the time. If it gives you trouble, just unplug it." I nodded, forcing a smile. My mind churned with questions, but I couldn't voice them. Instead, I let Jack finish his tour, his warm demeanor doing little to quell the chill in my bones. "Most employees don't stay here long," he admitted with a chuckle. "They say the night shift gets weird, but I think it's just their imaginations. Anyway, I'm glad you're here." By the time Jack left, I was already regretting my decision. The gas station felt oppressively quiet, the kind of silence that made you hyper-aware of every little sound. I settled behind the counter, trying to distract myself by flipping through an old magazine, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. That's when the radio crackled to life. It was the same static I'd heard during the call, a harsh, grating noise that set my nerves on edge. Then his voice came through. "Listen carefully," David said, his tone calm but urgent. "If you want to survive, you need to listen carefully to what I'm about to say." "David, please talk to me. Don't leave me again," I said, my voice breaking as tears streamed down my face. The static distorted his words, but I caught enough to understand. "If any appliance starts working on its own, disconnect it immediately and do not plug it back in. If you hear the sound of a phone ringing, check the security cameras first. If you see someone inside the building on the monitors, do not answer the phone. If you hear footsteps on the roof, do not go outside and do not check the security cameras. Stay in the office and leave all appliances running until the sound stops. If the cash register emits a loud screech and the screen displays the word leave, exit the building immediately and do not return." Before I could ask what any of it meant, the radio cut out, plunging me back into silence. The first hour passed uneventfully. I busied myself restocking shelves and cleaning the counter. The radio crackled intermittently, but I ignored it. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, though the security monitors showed nothing unusual. The aisles were empty, the parking lot deserted. It was almost peaceful, but the unease never left. At 1:15 a.m., the coffee machine sputtered to life with a violent shudder, as if something deep within it was waking up. I nearly dropped the stack of snack bags I was shelving. The machine hissed and steamed, its noises echoing unnervingly in the stillness, like a breath from some unseen force. David's warning played in my mind, growing louder with every hiss from the machine. I approached cautiously, my palms growing clammy. The digital display flickered erratically, strange symbols flashing across the screen, symbols I couldn't recognize but felt deeply unsettling, as though they were staring back at me. For a moment, I thought I saw movement in the reflection of the chrome surface, a dark shape shifting behind me. My hands trembled as I reached behind the machine, feeling for the plug. I yanked it out with a jolt and the hissing stopped abruptly, leaving an unnatural silence that felt far too heavy. I let out a shaky breath, staring at the now dead coffee machine, its presence still feeling ominous even without the noise. My heart was pounding, my ears straining for any sound. Then, the bell above the door jingled unexpectedly, cutting through the silence like a knife. I spun around, startled, to see a man entering the station. He was tall and clean-cut, with blue eyes that sparkled with faint amusement. "Didn't mean to scare you," he said, holding up his hands. "Just here for some cigarettes." I forced a smile, trying to steady my nerves. "No problem. Which brand?" "Camels," he replied, leaning casually against the counter. "You're new here, huh?" "Yeah," I said, handing him the pack. "First night." "Brave," he said with a chuckle. "Most people don't last long." "Why's that?" I asked, curious despite myself. He shrugged, his smile fading slightly. "Place gives people the creeps. Weird stuff happens, you know." I nodded, not trusting myself to say more. He paid for the cigarettes and I watched as he left, the door swinging shut behind him, feeling alone once again. 10 minutes after he left, the ancient landline behind the counter rang. The sound was jarring, shrill against the silence. I hesitated, the rule David had mentioned echoing in my mind. If you hear the sound of a phone ringing, check the security cameras first. If you see someone inside the building on the monitors, do not answer the phone. I glanced at the security monitors, my stomach dropping. On one screen, a little girl stood in the middle of the snack aisle. Her face was obscured, covered by long, tangled hair, and she was levitating slightly above the ground, her body swaying unnaturally. Then, slowly, she began to move towards me, her form gliding forward, the air around her rippling with darkness. I looked up, staring into the aisle, but there was nothing there, only empty shelves and silence. My eyes darted back to the monitor, and there she was, still moving closer, each movement deliberate and terrifyingly real, despite her absence in front of me. The phone continued to ring. My breath hitched as I stared at the screen, my hand hovering over the receiver. But I didn't answer. I couldn't. And then the ringing stopped. I looked back at the screen, and she was gone. My heart pounded, and a million questions raced through my mind. What was happening in this place? Was I losing my mind? Or was there something more sinister at play? The unease grew into a gnawing terror, and I felt a surge of fear that seemed to grip my entire body. I was trembling by the time the man from earlier returned. He stepped inside, his expression cautious. "You okay?" he asked, his eyes scanning the room. "You look like you've seen a ghost." I almost laughed at the absurdity of it, but it came out as more of a shaky exhale. "It's just been a weird night," I muttered, trying to downplay the fear that still clung to me. He frowned, leaning in slightly, his eyes narrowing with genuine concern. "Weird how?" I hesitated, glancing around the dimly lit room. How could I explain what was happening without sounding insane? How could I possibly describe the little girl in the aisle, the whispers, the strange rules that seemed to make no sense? But there was something about the way he looked at me, something earnest and open, that made me want to share, even if it sounded crazy. Against my better judgment, I found myself spilling the details. The flickering lights, the radio, the figure I'd seen on the monitor. To my surprise, he didn't dismiss me. Instead, he nodded thoughtfully, as if what I was saying made perfect sense. This place has always been strange. I've heard stories. Things disappearing, people feeling watched, strange figures showing up at night. His voice lowered, almost conspiratorial. People don't talk about it much, but it's like this station is alive somehow. His words sent a chill down my spine, and I shivered involuntarily. "Why'd you come back?" I asked, suddenly feeling very vulnerable. He smiled faintly, holding up a small lighter, the metal glinting in the dim light. "I forgot my lighter," he said, the smile not quite reaching his eyes. "Guess it's a good thing I did. Seems like you could use some company." The relief of having someone else there was short-lived. At 2 a.m., the footsteps started. They were faint at first, a soft creaking above us. The man, Elliot as he introduced himself, looked up, his brow furrowed. "Who the hell is on the roof?" My stomach churned as I remembered the rules. "Don't go outside," I whispered. "Don't check the cameras." Elliot raised an eyebrow. "What?" I grabbed his arm, my voice shaking. "Just trust me, stay here, don't touch anything." The footsteps continued, circling above us, each creak louder, like something was daring us to react. The tension was unbearable, and I could almost hear a taunting whisper in my mind. "Break the rules. Just check. Just see." My fists clenched tighter, nails digging into my palms, the pain grounding me. Elliot looked toward the ceiling, his expression shifting from confusion to something closer to fear. "Are you sure we shouldn't check?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. "No," I hissed, panic rising in my chest. It felt like the entire building was daring us to disobey, as if something was testing our resolve. I clenched my teeth, the sound maddening, every instinct in me screaming to do something. Suddenly, the cash register screeched, its digital display flashing the word "leave" in bold red letters. Elliot and I exchanged a panicked glance. "What the hell is going on?" he demanded. "We have to go," I said, grabbing his arm. "Now!" The doors refused to budge. The fire exit was locked. Panic set in as the gas station became a prison. The lights flickered again, casting shadows that seemed to move on their own. The radio crackled, and the guttural voice that followed froze me in place.
"You didn't escape that accident,"
the voice hissed.
"I let you live, but your time is up."
"But what is this?" Elliot stammered, his voice breaking the silence. I didn't answer. I couldn't. My throat was dry, my mind a whirl of terror and grief. The pieces clicked into place, each revelation more horrifying than the last. The static during the crash, the brakes failing. It wasn't a coincidence. This wasn't just a ghost or a trick of the mind. It was the thing behind the accident. It had killed my partner. It had followed me here. The voice cut through the air, sharp and grating. The radio on the counter buzzed with static, the vibrations rattling the small space. Elliot and I stood frozen, the oppressive darkness around us seeming to grow denser. The cash register screeched again, its screen flashing "leave" in red. But we couldn't. The doors were still locked, the fire exit jammed. I pulled at the handle with all my strength, but it refused to budge. Panic clawed at my chest. "Help me!" I yelled at Elliot, who stood staring at the radio as though hypnotized. He snapped out of it and rushed to my side, yanking at the door with me. The lights overhead flickered violently, casting erratic shadows that seemed to stretch and writhe. The oppressive weight of the entity's presence grew heavier. The lights flickered out completely. The gas station was plunged into darkness. I clutched Elliot's arm, my pulse thundering in my ears. "We need to find another way out," I whispered, though the silence felt deafening. A loud crash echoed from the back of the building. Elliot grabbed a flashlight from the counter and turned it on. The narrow beam sliced through the darkness, illuminating the aisles. The shadows seemed alive, writhing just beyond the light's reach. "This way," I urged, pulling him toward the stockroom. The crashing sounds grew louder, closer. I glanced over my shoulder, but the darkness was impenetrable. My mind raced. The rules David had given me, they were supposed to keep me safe. But now it felt as though the entity was rewriting them, bending the space around us to its will. We reached the stockroom door, and I shoved it open. The room was cramped, filled with shelves of supplies and boxes. The back door loomed ahead, but when I tried the handle, it wouldn't budge. "It's locked," I said, my voice trembling. Elliot searched frantically for something to break the lock. "There's gotta be something we can use," he muttered. Another crash echoed from the main room, followed by the sound of something heavy dragging across the floor. My stomach churned. Whatever it was coming closer. Elliot found a crowbar and wedged it against the lock. He grunted as he pressed down, the metal groaning under the pressure. "Come on," he growled. The dragging sound stopped just outside the stockroom door. I held my breath, clutching a box cutter I'd grabbed from the shelf. The air was thick with dread, an electric charge that made the hair on my arms stand on end. Then the door began to creak open. "No!" I screamed, shoving my weight against it. Elliot joined me, the two of us bracing against the force pushing from the other side. The door shook violently, as though something massive were on the other side. The wood splintered, and a guttural growl filled the room. The pressure was immense, and I felt my strength waning. "Get the lock," I yelled at Elliot. He swung the crowbar with all his strength, finally breaking the lock. The back door flew open, and cold night air rushed in. We tumbled outside, slamming the door shut behind us. The night was eerily quiet. The gas station loomed behind us, its windows glowing faintly as the lights inside flickered erratically. "We need to get to the car," Elliot said, his breath visible in the frigid air. I nodded, but my body felt numb. The weight of everything that had happened pressed down on me. The evil voice still echoed in my mind, its sinister promise chilling me to the core. We ran toward the parking lot, the gravel crunching beneath our feet. My car was just ahead, and I fumbled for my keys as we approached. The radio in my car buzzed to life before I even unlocked the doors. Static poured out, louder and more violent than before. The headlights flickered, and the engine roared to life on its own. "No!" I screamed, backing away. The car began to shake violently, the static from the radio reaching a deafening crescendo. Elliot grabbed my arm, pulling me toward the tree line. "Come on!" he shouted. We sprinted into the woods, the sounds of the gas station fading behind us. The trees were dense, their skeletal branches clawing at us as we pushed through. I stumbled over roots and rocks, my lungs burning with each breath. The static followed us, a relentless tide of sound that seemed to seep into my very bones. I could feel the entity's presence, a shadow that loomed closer with every step. We burst into a small clearing, collapsing to the ground. I gasped for air, my heart hammering in my chest. Elliot sat beside me, his face pale and glistening with sweat. "What the hell is this thing?" he asked, his voice trembling. I shook my head, tears streaming down my face. "It killed him, my partner. It caused the accident, and now it's coming for me." Elliot's eyes widened. "Why? What does it want?" Before I could answer, the static surged again, louder than ever. The shadows in the clearing began to writhe and twist, coalescing into a towering figure. Its form was amorphous, a mass of darkness shot through with flickering light. Its presence was overwhelming, a force of pure malevolence.
"You cannot escape.
It growled, its voice reverberating through the clearing.
You are mine."
I stood, trembling but resolute. "You took him from me," I said, my voice steady despite the terror coursing through me. "But you won't take me." The entity laughed, a sound that was more static than voice. Elliot grabbed my arm. "We have to run." "No," I said, my mind racing. "We can't outrun it, but I know how to weaken it." The gas station, the power grid. I remembered Jack's tour, the way he'd explained the circuit breakers in the back room. David had told me to come here, so it had to mean something. It had to be where the entity drew its power. If I could overload the system, I might be able to disrupt the entity's hold, weaken its influence, even if just for a moment. "Go," I told Elliot. "Get as far away as you can." "I'm not leaving you." "You have to. If this thing takes me, you can't be here too." He hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. "Don't die," he said, his voice thick with emotion. I ran back toward the gas station, the static growing louder with every step. The building loomed ahead, its windows glowing with an unnatural light. I burst through the back door, heading straight for the circuit breakers. The air felt thicker here, heavy with something malevolent. My legs trembled as I forced myself to move, my eyes locking onto the electrical panel ahead. Sparks danced across the floor like tiny, frantic fireflies. Then I saw him. David. He stood near the circuit box, his familiar silhouette bathed in the flickering light. For a moment, time seemed to stop. He turned to me, his face soft, his eyes filled with warmth. "Babe," he said, his voice steady and soothing, cutting through the chaos around us. "It's okay, you don't have to do this." I froze, tears welling in my eyes. My chest ached, the weight of grief colliding with the impossible. "David?" I whispered, barely able to speak. How are you here?" He stepped closer, his movements calm and deliberate. "I never really left," he said. "I've been with you the whole time, watching over you. You don't need to hurt yourself like this. Just come with me. We can be together again." His words were a balm to my raw, broken heart. For a brief, maddening moment, I wanted to believe him, to step into his arms and let everything else fade away. But something was wrong. The warmth in his eyes flickered just like the neon lights outside. His features, too perfect, too symmetrical, seemed almost rigid, as though they were being held together by sheer will. I took a step back, my body trembling. "You're not David," I said, my voice shaking but firm. The figure tilted its head, its smile faltering. "Of course it's me," it said, but there was a sharpness to its tone now, an edge that cut like glass. "I love you. I've always loved you. Don't you want to see me again?" The static in the room swelled, vibrating through my bones, and the figure began to flicker, its outline wavering like a faulty hologram. Its smile stretched unnaturally wide, the edges of its mouth tearing into the skin, its voice warped, no longer David's, but something darker, more guttural. "You think you can defy me?" it snarled. "You're nothing." I staggered back as the figure twisted and contorted, its limbs jerking at unnatural angles. Its form began to stretch and distort, a grotesque mockery of the man I had loved. Its scream tore through the air, a piercing, unearthly sound that made my ears ring. The floor beneath me quaked violently, cracks spidering across the walls as the entire building seemed to convulse in agony. I clutched the counter for balance, my gaze darting between the writhing abomination and the circuit box. My hands shook as I reached for the switches, the entity's distorted form looming closer. The entity lunged, its warped, claw-like hands reaching for me, but I yanked the switch with all my strength. The circuits overloaded with a deafening crack, a surge of energy tearing through the building. The lights flared blindingly bright before shattering, plunging the room into darkness. The thing shrieked, its voice an agonized wail that rattled my very soul. The ground buckled beneath me as I collapsed to my knees, shielding my face from the burst of heat and light. The screams grew fainter, fading into the static that had haunted me for so long. And then, silence. I stumbled outside, the cold night air hitting me like a wave. The gas station flickered behind me, its neon sign sputtering weakly. As I reached the edge of the parking lot, I heard it one last time, David's voice, soft and clear. "Run." I didn't look back. I ran until my legs gave out, collapsing on the side of the road. The faint sound of static lingered in the distance, a reminder that while I had escaped, the entity wasn't truly gone. But for now, I was free. The sun was just beginning to rise when I finally made it to the main road. My body was battered, my clothes torn, but the sight of the open road brought a glimmer of hope. The world seemed quieter now, as if the darkness I'd fled had taken its malice with it. I flagged down the first car I saw, a rusted pickup driven by an older man who eyed me with a mix of concern and caution. "You okay, miss?" he asked, his voice gruff but kind. I nodded, though I wasn't sure if it was true. "I need to get to town," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. He smiled, motioning for me to get in. As the truck rumbled down the road, I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see something looming behind us. but the road remained empty, and the static in my head began to fade. He dropped me off at a bustling diner just outside town, its warmth and lively energy a sharp contrast to the cold, desolate emptiness I had escaped. I found a corner booth and wrapped my hands around a steaming cup of coffee, the events of the night swirling endlessly in my mind. I felt like a shadow among the living, physically present yet utterly lost in my thoughts. I thought about Elliot. I didn't know where he went, but I hoped he was okay. His kindness, his willingness to stay when he could have run. It had given me strength when I needed it most. I hoped he was somewhere safe, far from the entity's grasp. And then there was David. His voice had guided me, saved me even in death. I closed my eyes, letting the warmth of the coffee seep into my hands. "Thank you," I whispered, my words meant for him, wherever he was. As I sat in the booth, struggling to stay awake, his phone buzzed unexpectedly. I stared at it, my heart pounding as the screen lit up, displaying a single message. "Keep going. I'm proud of you." Tears blurred my vision as I clutched the phone to my chest. The static didn't follow this time, just a calm, steady silence.